Hello, everybody, and welcome to week one of Ecology and Science Fiction.
This is our first weekly meetup, so if you are listening to this, it must be at least Thursday afternoon.
We're hoping to always make sure that these are available to you by Thursday afternoon, and you'll have time between Thursday, Friday, Saturday to listen to these and join us in the discussion. We're both pretty excited about being able to discuss these topics with you.
So consider this your virtual classroom and try and picture us all sitting and talking together.
But in reality, we're sitting in my office, and we have no idea where you are when you're listening to this.
Yes, we are on some unnamed day and year, and it's sunny outside, and we're happy to be talking to you.
And Becky saw a hawk fly by my window and was very excited. So,
yes, it was a very pretty hawk.
So let's start talking a little bit about literature. You're in a literature course, and I think we need to keep that in the forefront. But you're in a specific type of literature, a genre, which is science fiction. And so I thought we would just open up a little bit about what is literature.
Yes, because throughout this class we will be teaching you literary analysis techniques, and we'll try our very hardest to point out when we are doing that so that you can identify them. But one of the reasons we're asking what is literature this week is not only because it's the beginning of the course, but also because this week we had you listen to a story, audibly listen to a story, instead of actually reading it. And so that is part of the question, what is literature? Do you have to actually be physically reading a book in order for it to be considered literature? Back, 100, 200 years ago, yes, that was absolutely the case. But now we have audiobooks.
And prior to that would have been storytellers. Before there would have been written word, you would have had people sharing stories, talking about events and passing them on just by word of mouth.
Absolutely. We went from like an oral culture to a written culture, and now in some ways we're going back into oral, but certainly multimedia.
Multimedia culture, because we're combining sound and and video, audio sort of things all together. So I think it's kind of interesting that when we're thinking about this, like you, as an example, you all listened to the WUB this week. If we would have been in a classroom setting, one of us probably would have read the WUB to you, and I've done that in past classes. Whether someone reads it to you, you listen to it, or you read it yourself, I don't think in any way changes that it's a piece of literature.
No, and that's one of the themes within science fiction. It's kind of an implicit theme, which is that it's a genre. And, we can talk about whether it's accurate to call it a genre or not, but I think that's a fairly safe label. It's a genre that includes what we would consider low and high culture at the same time. So in the United States especially, not going to get too historical on us, but we were trying to compete with Europe for a long time because we were a young country. And so they had this high culture that we were trying to make copies of, essentially, and make our own literature in response to. And for a long time, we were really hesitant to like low culture, right? I mean, if you talk to your friends about what you're studying in this class and you say it's a literature class and you're like, oh yeah, and I'm watching Star Trek, they might, make kind of a double take and be like, wait a minute, that doesn't really sound like literature. So part of the theme of this course is recognizing that the types of literary analysis techniques that we use with what you might traditionally think of as literature really works for a wide variety of media, and that the definition of literature now is a lot wider than it used to be.
Yeah, the story, the narrative takes many forms. The idea that you are going to be watching TV shows, movies, reading short stories, reading them online, listening to them, reading comic books, graphic novels. We're going to be talking about that in some later weeks. All of those things to say that here are stories about humans and human interaction and humans thinking about their future, which we'll talk a little bit later, I think, in this podcast.
Right.
And then the story itself, which we're using as sort of our starting point, which is Philip K. Dick's The WUB. And we'll do a few more things with Philip K. Dick throughout the semester, just because he's just, I don't know what you'd say, he's written so many things. You all have watched Philip K. Dick movies.
Yeah, he's just a classic science fiction novelist that you probably weren't aware that the movies that you have seen are based on his books.
Or aware that some movies you watch were based on comic books. So it's fascinating to know that you've consumed media that's based on literature, and there are writers involved in every aspect of that. So let's just take a little bit of a look at the WUB and
yes, we really enjoyed reading your comments about the WUB in your journals and also in your discussion. So the first thing that we wanted to start off with is one of the most confusing aspects of the story, which is the end. What actually happens to the wub? You know, you have this building tension throughout the story that Captain Franco wants to eat the wub, right? He is building up all of these reasons why the wub is essentially only useful for eating, you know, for providing nutrition for human beings. And then the wub obviously is arguing against that all the way. So what actually happens at the end? Does the wub die?
Yeah, you have this wub, which looks, as they describe it, as just a massive hog-like creature that is so large as they're bringing it, you know, into the ship and down the hallways, it's scraping the sides, and it's just ponderous, I think, in a lot of ways.
It's big, it's fat, it's breathing hard, it's having a hard time getting around. It's not an attractive creature.
No. But you have the captain, I mean, who's somebody that's a very interesting character because, you know, you find out in the story that the captain was raised on a farm, that his interaction with hogs he's very familiar with. And so he immediately takes his historical past and applies it to his present.
Right.
Something that we as human beings do. We take how our perspective, experiences shapes the way in which we engage the world. And so, you know, if it looks like a hog and smells like a hog and acts like a hog, and I know what a hog is, this must be a hog.
Right. And that kind of assumption you'll notice throughout the story continues even after the wub starts talking, which is not like a hog, and engaging in moral debates. The captain still maintains that kind of label based on his past experience.
So you have this captain who, once they bring this wub on board, and I think, you know, we were talking a little bit before this, you know, you point out that point, Becky, that he ignores all the other food.
Right. They're loading huge amounts of animals on the ship. You know, the captain's acting really, really concerned that he and his crew are going to have enough food even for the next month. And yet he is absolutely obsessed with specifically eating the wub.
And we can draw a lot of conclusions to say, you know, here's somebody who, from their background, not only knows what a hog looks like, smells like, acts like, but knows what a hog tastes like.
Right.
And so probably a little bit of nostalgia, a little bit of a desire to revisit, you know, some past experience can be with this particular wub.
Well, and maybe, I mean, we can talk about the conflict that builds throughout the story, but maybe the fact that the wub is talking, which confuses the heck out of the captain, maybe that'll all just be kind of laid to rest if he actually tastes the wub and it still tastes like a hog. Then he can kind of prove to himself that he was right in the end.
Right. This isn't something that's intelligent or smart or anything else like that. Or maybe it's guilt of, you know, when I ate hogs in the past, you know, and I think some of you might have mentioned that in your journals.
Yeah,
you know,
I think you did.
You know, several of you were talking about, okay, am I eating an intelligent creature here? Should I not be eating this animal because even though I don't understand it, maybe it's as intelligent as I am or as smart as I am, and you know that would be kind of a rude awakening to find out that your food talks back to you.
Right.
In this case. But you have this, you know, the wub comes on board and begins to talk. And not only does it talk, but with one particular crew person, you know, he begins to philosophize.
Yeah.
And theology. He understands Earth stories. He understands mythology. He understands theology. He's bringing up all these great conversations. And so they're having this great theological debate and conversation. And then he's brought before the captain.
Well, and you also, as a side note, get the impression that the wub knows theology and philosophy from, like, multiple planetary systems. He's only talking about the ones that are based on Earth because he's talking to Earthlings. Right. So he's got this, like, vast knowledge.
So where did this hog, fat, ponderous creature who, you know, doesn't have a ship of its own, how did it acquire all this knowledge? I think that's the thing that Dick's saying is,
that's like the unknown mystery.
It's the unknown mystery. You're judging, you know, you begin to judge this book by its cover, and you don't, you know, sort of contemplate and ask those deeper questions of where did this knowledge and information come from. So we have the confrontation between the wub and the captain that takes place. So the wub goes into the captain's quarters, and they have this conversation, which is more of a debate. I mean, the wub says, why should you eat me? Why should we not consider eating somebody else in the crew?
Right.
You know, he considers himself on equal par.
He brings up democracy, essentially, as several of you brought up, which I thought was a great point.
And so they have this conversation, and they have this talk, and there's this moment when the captain seems like he's going to do something violent towards the wub, and the wub looks right into his eyes, and the captain freezes.
Yes,
so
physically freezes.
Physically freezes. And the crew finds him like that.
Yes.
Finds him frozen in his cabin.
Yeah, the wub leaves the room, and the crew finds the captain just standing there completely physically frozen.
Right. So they come, the captain comes, I think other people come, and they're not all on the same page. I mean, we get the sense that the captain has become driven, I believe, in some ways, obsessed almost with this wub. And this obsession is driving him to say, I'm going to conquer this wub. I'm superior to this wub.
Right.
That you are nothing but food, and I'm going to prove that you are nothing but food.
Right. And the best way to prove that is to taste you.
Right. I'm going to consume you. And I think that consumption aspect of human nature is, we desire to consume that which we want to possess. And we do it we do it figuratively, we do it literally in a lot of ways. Even a lot of cultures have had that consumption mentality. So we have this point where he has the gun, he's pointing at the wub, and even the wub questions and says, "Can you really do that? Do you really want to do that? Is this what you want to do?"
Basically, while somebody is talking to you, looking you in the eye, and intelligently engaging you, can you really shoot me? Is that something you're capable of doing?
That's right. And so there's this instant where something happens right before the trigger is pulled.
And it's very quick, so you might have missed it.
And you probably missed it. And what actually happens, for those of you that listened to that, did not catch that, is that at that moment, there was a transference of the consciousness of the wub into the body of the captain, and the body of the captain into the wub.
And so that happens even before the body of the wub is killed and consumed.
That's right.
And that's something that it's a little bit hard to notice the first time that you read through the story, because you think, oh, well, he ate the wub and now the wub is inside of him. The wub was a little bit quicker than the captain was in this case.
Right. So his defensive mechanisms were to do this body swap. That's part of this that takes place. And the crew is sort of oblivious to this. And so you have the dinner scene where they're eating, and the crew, the captain now, the captain / wub, is thoroughly enjoying himself.
Yes.
And has said, I've heard a lot about what wub would taste like, but I did not realize it would taste so great. Sort of more or less. And the clue then is when he turns to the crewman and says, now where were we? In our philosophy discussion.
Right, in our philosophy discussion.
Yeah, let's go back to our philosophy discussion. And that's when he realizes that the captain is gone. And he talks about things being just matter. It's just matter now. It's not really the essence of the person. It was the shell of the person. And I think that gives us some clues into who or what was the wub. You all, from your readings, and probably most people from their initial readings, think the wub is what is physically described to us.
Right.
And I think if you pick up on the clues throughout that, you'll realize that we have no idea what this creature is. The creature itself was probably a wub.
Right. So the original body that this character, the wub, was inhabiting was probably originally a pig-like creature living in the forests of that planet that the ship had landed on in order to gather food. So at some point, whatever the consciousness of the wub is, had put itself inside of that pig creature. But if you look back through, and I know that you have the audiobook, but the written version of it is online as well if you want to look back through it. If you look back through the story, the way that the wub is constantly described is in physical terms. Correct. So this is getting into a little bit of literature analysis now, okay, because we're looking at the structure of the way it's written. So he's constantly, and I'm just saying he because that's how I picture him. We don't know what this thing's gender is.
She, it. We have no idea what the gender really is of the wub itself or the entity who was in the wub.
Right. And so anyway, constantly described in physical terms. It's big, it's slow, it's sweating, it can't breathe well enough, it's having difficulty, it needs water, right? So it's constantly described in physical terms, but then you have the contradiction of it speaking these really complicated philosophical, I'm having trouble talking, conversations, right? And so you've got that contrast immediately, and that's kind of the clue that Dick is giving us at the beginning, but we don't recognize it, that the consciousness of this creature doesn't originally belong in that body. It's not the body that defines the creature in this particular case.
Yeah, so the wub, the wub is the body, but there's an alien entity that inhabits the wub, and that alien entity explains that they pass being its kind, explore cultures and planets and other worlds by embodying the creatures of that particular world. Hence the reason it's acquired all this knowledge of Earth and all this knowledge of this of the Mars planet that we're seeing portrayed to us, is that this entity sort of body hops from creature to creature to creature. And now we see that it now embodies the captain. So the captain, as we knew, the captain no longer exists, just the body that was the captain is there, and the entity that was in the wub is now the soul, the whatever you want to call it, the essence of is in this captain. And it's interesting because the crew of this ship is supposed to be exploring space and other worlds and engaging them, and we don't really see much of that. What we would call like sort of respect towards other cultures in outer space. We see more of a consumption.
It's kind of an irony that's set up in the story because the people on the spaceship are quote-unquote explorers that are going to explore different parts of space, right? And presumably they're from the United States, right? Because it's written in English and it's written, in the 1950s when the United States is like the New World superpower. So of course they would be the ones going to space. But ironically, the creature that is really doing what we would probably now consider actual exploration is the wub, because it is inhabiting other alien bodies to learn all about their cultures, like not just about stupid mundane things like what kind of food they like to eat or how often they have to drink water or anything like that, but their deepest philosophical thoughts and the stories about
their literature.
Yeah, their literature, exactly. So it's an irony because the captain and his crew are kind of the stereotypical explorers that we would think of, particularly in the 1950s when this is written, and then the wub is actually the one who's kind of the real explorer in the story.
So if we were faced with a disgusting, sweaty, fat, slobbering creature who just, you look at and think, I have no respect whatsoever, and on my world, we eat something like this. I don't know. Well, what would you do? I mean...
Right. I mean, this is kind of like a classic embodiment, and we're skipping around a little bit in our notes here, so... But since Jim brought that up, there is this idea, not only in literature, but also in other genres as well, of the other, the capital O other. So this idea that some people, many people actually, define who they are as a group based on how they're different from others. Okay? And so the captain in this case, certainly, and also to some extent his crew, identifies themselves as humans in opposition to this wub. Now, obviously, some members of the crew don't see quite as distinctive a line of difference as the captain does. So this is kind of an example of the theme of the other. It's also an interesting example, again, given that this story was written, if I'm not mistaken, in 1952. This is an example of a colonial theme, okay? And that's something that's very much part of United States history, because first the European countries were colonizers, and then the United States
became a colonizer.
Right? So we would go into other communities, other countries, and we would say, we've got a bunch of advanced technology, we've, got the right way to do things, guys, we're going to work things out for you so that your life is better. And oftentimes that was not effective because we weren't really listening to the culture and how they viewed the world. So in this particular case, the story starts off with the crew and the captain landing on this planet and taking all their animals. Right? And this kind of chieftain figure is kind of grudgingly handing the animals over, like, okay, I've got to go organize more hunts now because we're going to be out of food.
Right. And then you have the priest character. I mean, that's there.
Exactly.
That's almost like a missionary to the Martians.
Yes.
Who is not happy that they're sort of stripping the land, taking what they want. Very much, again, the colonizers. What do we need? How will we consume this? We're dominant. We're bigger than you. We're stronger than you. We're smarter than you, as you said. We're going to take your stuff from you.
And one good example that one of you brought up in your journals is the comparison of the European settlers coming to the United States and meeting the Native Americans. There was this kind of assumption on the part of the Europeans. They're basically like, well, you guys don't speak English, and you don't live in houses, and you don't, own deeds to your land, so obviously you're not civilized, so we're just going to have to show you how to live properly, And so you see that the captain and the crew are kind of taking that role in the story. But then ironically, as Jim and I were talking about this before we started the podcast, the wub is actually the ultimate colonizer because in the end he'll just take over your body. But
from a more ecologically sound perspective. In other words, if you think about this sort of the ecology that's going on, the human colonizers are coming in and taking and stripping away.
Yes, they're physically taking animals off of that planet and disrupting the ecosystem.
They're identifying what fits our needs, what can we consume. We need these because we need these to survive.
And we don't care where we fit into this system because it's not our home.
So the wub comes in, not really the wub, but the alien entity comes onto the planet and assumes becomes part of the ecology.
Yeah, it becomes a pig-like creature.
Pig-like creature. And it doesn't come in and assume one of the Martians or one of the dominant creatures or a predator or anything like that.
Right.
Actually comes in and assumes, when you're looking at the foods with the scale, the food chain.
Right.
The
so
food chain.
It's like
an omnivore, the lower part of the food chain.
Like, grubbing around in the forest for...
Which is a more peaceful, non-threatening type of character. As opposed to the dominance of the other characters. So I think that's an interesting piece because we've talked about, there's all these different, we're talking about theology. One of the things I mentioned before is that, your theological view, your theological perspective shapes your ethical perspective. It stems from that. It stems from your moral compass and what you do. It's based and grounded in a theology that says, this is the world, this is the importance and intention of the world, and this is why we're here. So that drives your actions and your interactions. And I think that you can take this story, and I think that's what I find most fascinating about it, and you can have an ethical discussion, a philosophical discussion, literature discussion. Pretty much.
There's social commentary. There's everything.
We can talk about the women in the story. That there are none.
There are absolutely no women. Yep.
In the story at all.
Which is very characteristic of the 1950s.
Yeah. So there is no representation at all. We can talk about how the priest was treated, monk, priest, whatever the character is in the beginning.
Right.
That total disregard, not an authority figure whatsoever.
If you don't have a spaceship in this story, basically the captain doesn't have time for you.
Right. It's all about your rocket.
Right. Sorry, guys, we're going a little far afield, but
no, it really is something to consider, and those are the things I think we want you to consider as you engage all the stories, as you engage all the media, all the stories, as you launch. This is our first week. As we launch into the next several weeks together, think about those things. How are people represented? How are people not represented? The absence of is sometimes more important than the presence of.
For example, in this case, there are no women in the story. Is there a reason for that or not? Some of the social commentary that we've just, barely touched on is this being the 1950s. We're in the middle of the Cold War. We're fighting in quotations, the Soviet Union, right? And so we're essentially pitting democracy against communism. Several of you brought up, which I thought was great, this idea that the wub is essentially trying to sell democracy to the captain and his crew, and the captain is not listening. So is this... And, there's no right answer to this, okay? This is part of the literary analysis that you do. Looking at the context of the time, is Philip K. Dick trying to suggest, maybe democracy is really in danger here? Maybe we need to be careful about people in the military or just people in general, following a leader like the captain a little bit too closely and not questioning him enough. Why is nobody stepping in trying to help the wub?
Right. So those things are what we kind of want you to keep in mind as you're going forward. The context, as Becky mentioned, of when something was written tells you a lot about the culture and society, but that doesn't necessarily inform or determine the total truth of what that story can say.
Absolutely.
Because consumption at a later date, if the story is still being consumed, it must have something to say for later generations as well.
Absolutely. If you have something from the 21st century to say about the wub that Philip K. Dick could never have even dreamed of, that's okay. That's part of literature. Once an author sets a story loose, there's nothing they can do to help determine how the readers are going to interpret it. In terms of ecological themes, too, one really important thing that we want you to pick up in this story, which is going to come up over and over again, particularly in science fiction. When we take our stories and we put them in like outer space or in the future, one thing that we have to ask ourselves is, what is nature in that place or in that time? You know, we kind of have this generic idea of what the human relationship to nature is. And for example, when you guys are watching Blade Runner, nature will have dramatically changed on Earth in that story, right? But what if you're on Mars? Okay, is the natural environment on Mars also nature? And do we have a similar relationship to that as humans? Or is nature something that's endemic to Earth? That's something that we'll need to consider in science fiction stories.
So when you're reading through Seed and you're thinking about the literary analysis aspects of this, and we're looking at the WUB's pretty easy when we think about what makes it sci-fi. We're going to be coming back to that question over and over and over again, and we'll kind of conclude that through the last week. But when we look at what makes a story sci-fi, a story can be basically at its core a romance story, but has elements of sci-fi. You know, the two people in a relationship, one's in the 19th century and one's in the 27th century, and somehow through some sort of time thing
and technological device, they're able to contact each other.
But at its core, it's a romance story, or it's a drama, or it's a mystery, or it's an action sort of story. So the genre itself is what shapes it. So when you're looking at the WUB and asking what makes the WUB sci-fi, the question itself says, you know, we have space travel, we're on Mars, we have some technology. Not elaborate, nothing really elaborate's going on here, but we also have sort of this supernatural aspect of a creature that doesn't act like a human.
Right, they're essentially communicating via telepathy.
Telepathy, and able to use that to freeze the captain, able to use that to body swap. I mean, so we have some aspects of that which makes it sci-fi and makes those sort of connections. I think also the idea that sci-fi is basically grounded or has its roots in the Earth as we know it and then proceeds forward into potential futures.
Right, the Earth as we imagine it, or the future Earths as we imagine them. And oftentimes you'll notice, and we'll talk about this when we get to like utopias and dystopias, oftentimes we're projecting our fears and anxieties into the future. This may involve technology. So you'll notice, and I think several of you brought up in Seed, that sometimes science fiction stories are written directly because some new technology has come out and it's freaking people out. And so they want to kind of go through the exercise of imagining what the future with that technology is going to be like.
Right. So fear of robots, fear of the future, fear of the technology. Sometimes it's to warn about it. Sometimes it's to educate and try to get people to embrace it.
And sometimes it's to say it's going to make the world a better place.
Or just a different place.
Yeah.
So this idea of what it is, I mean, we're entertained by it. Sometimes it's light sci-fi and very subtle. Sometimes it's intense, heavy sci-fi. And I think when a lot of you think, oh, I'm not into sci-fi, I think you're really thinking of the hardcore space sci-fi.
That's trying to educate you essentially on how to be an astronaut.
Yeah. And hopefully you'll see that that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
It's part of it.
Sci-fi can be educational. It can actually try and teach you about science. And some people enjoy that. But it can also just be entertaining.
Well, I just also meant it's not always about astronauts.
Well, it's certainly not always about astronauts, as you will find out.
So, a lot of you bring up the what if, and as we kind of close this out, I think we should ask the question of, and we're gonna discuss all these things. So, as you listen to this, don't lose track of, if we didn't mention something that was in your discussion or your journal, bring that up in the discussion.
Yes,
so please.
We are just beginning the discussion, and then the actual discussion forum that accompanies this is where we will continue the conversation.
Right. So the what if question is, if sci-fi isn't the place where you explore what if questions, where do you explore what if questions? I mean, how do you do that? How do you imagine or contemplate a possible future for yourself? I find that using science fiction and things that aren't necessarily closely connected to us provides an environment in which we have the freedom to ask what if, to explore possibilities, to look at something outside of our own context. Sometimes if we look at certain topics or social commentary or issues that are too personal and too close to home, then what happens is that our biases or our fears or these other things get in the way.
It can be distressing.
Yeah. But if we take and remove those things into a what if or an unknown or an imaginary future or imaginary possibility, then what happens is that we can begin to think broader and dream broader and be more outside of in a different context.
And that's definitely one of the goals of a lot of science fiction. So in this discussion, one of the things that we want you to think about is, if you already watch or read science fiction, great. Start thinking about how you use that media to kind of go through your mind some of the what if questions that you think about. And if you don't use sci-fi for that right now, what do you use in order to go through that exercise? And it might take you a while to think about this because it's kind of a personal question. But I have a feeling that we'll have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, and don't get all bogged down on like this week being a short week and you're feeling like sort of rushed with journals and discussions. You now have a full week until next Thursday to do the next section of things. So, the discussion won't launch until Sunday, but you still have, this discussion with us to work on. But you can be reading ahead. You can be thinking about your journal entries ahead of time and having some of that taken care of. Keep in mind you're going to be writing a short story, so think about that. You're also going to be picking out a text that you're going to read this semester that you're going to do an analysis of for your final project. So
it's never too early to start asking us questions.
Ask us questions, send us emails. What do you think about this story? Will this one work? I really have one in mind. And if it's one you've already read before and you're already someone that likes sci-fi, that's perfectly fine because you're going to be going in and now and doing an analysis. You might have read something for entertainment, and now you're going to be looking at it critically, and that's a little different approach, and it will change your understanding of what something was that you've already read.
But we're going to end this now because it's gotten kind of long, so we're looking forward to continuing the conversation with you online. Thank you for listening.
Take care.